I'm Helen Lord. I'm CEO of the Vulnerability Registration Service. This is one of many events that we've run over the last couple of years. Normally I've got Kirsty working alongside me, who would typically introduce the event and so on. She's off on maternity leave at the moment. For those that know her, she had a little boy at the beginning of July. So she will be rejoining us hopefully in the not too distant future. If you have any questions, and we'll open up a Q&A session after each few presentations. Simon Towers is also here, so he's going to facilitate that. So any questions at all, just drop them in the chat as we go along, and we'll try and pick those up. I think what we're covering off today is very focused around consumer duty. Obviously, there are tight timescales in terms of what the FCA are looking for, and we thought it was very timely to do this. I mean, in some senses, it might be a little bit drier today than some of our webinars in the past. What I like to do is try and bring people in talking about people that they deal with, the circumstances of people are in, charities, debt management companies, all sorts, to really try and put a real life slant on what we're talking about, because I think we can get very corporate about it and forget that when we're talking about vulnerability, we are talking about real people. But I think it was important to talk about consumer duty, but equally I'm conscious that there's a lot of people here that probably aren't FCA regulated. Obviously the spirit of what consumer duty is about is relevant to all of us, and I guess whatever any of the other regulators come out with, whether it's Ofgem, whether it's the gambling sector, whatever it is, I think what we're talking about today will be wholly relevant. Just to give you yeah,
Helen, sorry, do you want to just put that onto from beginning, just so that the slides are showing? They're not showing fully.
Are they not?
No, if you want to just click slideshow from beginning.
Oh.
Stop
Am I sharing at all at the moment?
Stop share and come back again.
Okie dokie. Right, just my
You okay?
well, no, my I tell you what, Kirsty, Heidi, sorry, if you run that poll and I'll start again with the sharing. So we've got a poll based on consumer duty, which really is to get an idea. On the 31st of October, we should, if we're an FCA regulated organisation, have an implementation plan in place, and consumer duty for existing products and future products needs to be applied from the 31st of July 2023. So I thought it'd be really interesting to see where organisations are in terms of putting together that implementation plan for the 31st of October. So this poll really is to get an idea of that, and obviously if it's not relevant to you, there's a not applicable button. So if you'd like to do that, is that released now, Heidi?
Yep, everybody's got that on their screens. So just give you a few more moments. Okay. Right, people are still clicking their buttons. Right, you just let me know when you want me to end the poll so you can see the answers.
Okay.
We've got about 155 of you have answered, 156. There's a few still coming through. So, do you have an implementation plan to comply with consumer duty? Press your buttons now.
Okay.
Okay, so let's end the poll and then I shall share the results for you. There you go.
Okay. So I just thought this would be useful for us to sort of think about when we're working through today. So where are we today? 21st of September. So Consumer Duty, the expectation is for an implementation plan to be in place by the 31st of October. So I guess that speaks for itself, and I think we've just got over a month to pull that together. So 17% have yes, 47%, which is great, have that in progress. So we are getting there. So just thought that'd be interesting. I'm going to leave my presentation at the moment. It seems to have completely disappeared. So I'm going to pass over to Andrew in a moment to really give a high level overview of what Consumer Duty is all about and how it's relevant to us. But what we've got today, the speakers are all partners that VRS works with. We all work together. We pulled together a collaborative response not long ago to the FCA's Dear CEO letter, and I've put a link at the beginning of the chat to that. It was downloaded by a lot of people, but it was all our takes on what the FCA were really expecting. The people speaking today are all trying to provide solutions for organisations to help them deal with vulnerability, to deal with the vulnerability journey, and it's really about their take on what Consumer Duty says and where that's leading us to. So again, thank you all, but we're going to cover off identifying vulnerability, and you'll get me back again in a minute, hopefully with a presentation. Simon and Joseph all talking about identifying vulnerability, but we're aware that that's only part of the process, and understanding it, understanding what to do with it, and financial side of it, health and lifestyle capabilities. So we've got Andrew from Nash, we've got Mark from iHub, and then lastly, an area that gets a huge amount of concern is how we train our staff, how we support our staff in dealing with vulnerable customers. So we'll be talking about signposting, we'll be talking about training and inclusive service design. And then Heidi, thank you for jumping in here. The next slide, and again, please. Yeah, so that's the paper that our partners wrote. We all work together. So if there's things that we do individually that would help your organisation in dealing with your customers on their customer journey, then we can join together and we can provide solutions between us. So please do get in touch with any of us if we can support you in any way through this. So that's it from me for the moment. I shall pass over to Andrew Gething from Morgan Ash, who will give you a very informative overview on Consumer Duty.
Thank you, Helen. I'm just going to share my screen, bring up some slides. Excellent. I think that's working okay. Just excellent. So my name's Andrew Gething. I'm the founder and managing director of Morgan Ash. And for this session, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of Consumer Duty regulations. I'll be talking later about Morgan Ash and the solution we have. So as Helen said, Consumer Duty is particularly from financial services, but it's worth pointing out that the impetus for this regulation has come from government, just as they did for vulnerability. So the wording that the FCA uses, Consumer Duty, but if you're not an FCA regulated firm, then sort of think it as duty of care of customers, because that's how it may be applied in your sector. So the FCA is the Financial Conduct Authority, and us is the regulator for the financial services. In February 21, they introduced regulation on vulnerability, and most people, I suspect, on this call will be familiar with that, even if it's from a different sector. And in July this year, they implemented the Consumer Duty regulations. Consumer Duty effectively bolsters the need to look after vulnerable customers, and indeed puts more pressure on firms to manage vulnerable customers, and its massive relevance to VRS and this audience. We are now in the implementation phase. Firms have until July 2023, that's 9 months away, to comply with the new rules for currently marketed products, and July 2024 for old books of business. Firms must have implementation plans ready for inspection by the FCA by the end of October 2022, i.e. in 28 working days. And as the quick poll by Helen there showed, there's very few of us are actually ready to do that. Looks like most of it on implementation. So there's a lot to do. So it is both a challenge and an opportunity for firms. Consumer duty is a significant piece of regulation, introduces new consumer principle, which requires firms to act to deliver good outcomes for retail customers. That's independent, you and me, retail customers. It applies across all business lines to all firms as product manufacturers, intermediaries, brokers, all alike. Consumer duty regulations include vulnerability regulations. Indeed, vulnerability is mentioned over 100 times in the guidance document. A subtle difference is the duty requires firms to measure the outcome for the consumer. And that's the outcome at the end of the sort of product life cycle. While vulnerability requires requirements, but generally we're focusing on understanding the customer at the start of the customer journey. However, these are totally complementary, as when the consumer has a bad outcome, the firm needs to understand if actions it took at the start of the customer journey resulted in having a bad outcome at the end. So although the terminology and referring of customer outcomes may at first light seem not to be relevant to vulnerability, they absolutely are. The focus on outcomes then, the regulation does focus that into 4 areas. I don't get too worried about these, but essentially it looks about the governance and products and services, the price and value of the product, how much the consumer understood about the product, and then finally consumer support, i.e. support during its life cycle. Today, I'm just going to focus on a few key changes with regard to interacting with the consumer at an individual level, which will be most important to those involved in vulnerability. Some of the issues you can cover acting at a product level without necessarily understanding the individual consumer. A big change is the need to monitor consumer journey throughout the life of the product, i.e. for mortgages, this can be 25 years or even longer. This involves understanding the consumer's specific circumstances. For example, any changes in employment status or family composition that may affect the suitability of the product. A second big change, firms must demonstrate that they are complying with consumer duty. They must keep evidence they have done this. They must provide management information to the board so the board can attest, and that's to verify that they are implementing the duty. To evidence that customers are receiving good outcomes, firms will be required to collect significant volumes of data and management information. What data is collected, how this is managed, is probably the biggest task firms will face. And indeed, many of the presentations today will be looking at that topic. A small but significant requirement is to understand the protected characteristics of consumers in accordance with the Equalities Act. Consumer duty requires firms to monitor and report on this over and above the requirements of the Act. Firms will need to understand protected characteristics as well as vulnerability characteristics. This is especially difficult in an intermediated market, i.e. where you have a provider and then someone else doing the selling, as there are requirements to communicate and monitor between manufacturers and intermediaries. This is a totally new concept to intermediary relationship, and one of the big challenges it faces. The fourth big change I want to highlight is that of self-policing. Self-policing is not a term which is used in the documentation. Firms have always been required to treat customers fairly. The FCA has effectively moved the responsibility for identifying poor behaviour from itself, the regulator, to the industry.
Andrew, sorry, you've gone on mute. Not sure how, but you're on mute there.
Thank you. Am I back?
There you go, you're back.
Let me go back. The fourth big change I wanted to highlight is that of self-policing. Firms have been required to treat customers fairly, but the FCA has effectively moved the responsibility for identifying poor behaviour from itself, the regulator, to the industry. Firms must not only police themselves, but report to the FCA if they find others in their distribution chain who are not implementing the duty correctly. So essentially, this is whistleblowing on anyone you're working with who is not acting in the best interest of the consumer. Firms must hence now measure outcomes for their customers and identify and correct any behaviours that lead to poor outcomes. So it's not okay to be sitting there saying, well, I did my job, it's the other party who's let the customer down. If that's the instance, you must report, you must first off try and work with them to correct it, and secondly then report to the FCA. To bring this more back relevant to home, many firms have already implemented work streams for the identification of vulnerable customers. And I suspect most people on the call today will be in that camp. They need to incorporate it in the overall approach to consumer duty. In many cases, vulnerability data has relied on subjective assessments. This approach has already shown to lack consistency and hence will need to be upgraded to objective assessments in order to provide consistent, reliable data for management information. There are also requirements to monitor fair value, servicing of products, and indeed product design itself. All these require a good understanding of the consumer, including vulnerable consumers and those with protected characteristics. For most firms, the most efficient way to do this will be to summate data on individual customers. Hence, the need to manage vulnerability data has increased considerably. Monitoring the consumer can be undertaken by the intermediary or the manufacturer, and one party is allowed to rely on the other. Sharing the monitoring between intermediaries and manufacturers is likely to be more attractive in the wider market. For instance, the intermediary may wish to monitor consumers' changing needs for certain products, but perhaps let the manufacturer take the responsibility for other products. Regardless of which option is selected, the communication flow between manufacturer and intermediary is likely to increase, and it will need systems and data to do this. There's a lot to do, and undertaking this internally within firms in the timescale is going to be is going to be difficult and a big challenge. It's great that VRS have put together these sessions from firms who can help. I'll now hand you back to Helen to continue. Helen, are you with us?
Yeah, that's better. Must be that.
I am with you. Yes, thank you, Andrew. And any questions relating to the stuff that Andrew just covered, we'll pick up in a little while. And please, please sort of put anything you want to do in your chat now. Hopefully, I have got a presentation that is going to start to work now. Is that working?
Yeah, if you just go to slideshow at the top from beginning.
Yeah.
That's it.
Perfect. Okay. So I'm not going to sort of labour what vulnerability registration service does, because I think I cover that in most of our webinars. Hopefully most of you know, but I mean, in essence, we are a central database to share data about individuals who are in vulnerable circumstances, whether that be financial or whether that be circumstantial, or whether that is both, and that is our reason for being. And we try to collect data from any sector, because we really believe that that's embracing that whole data sharing model is of huge value to the consumer. If they're in a vulnerable situation, it's going to be relevant to any aspect of their life, whether that's with their bank, whether it's with their mobile phone provider, whether it's with a utility company or whatever. And that's what we're all about. We've always been very conscious that making the data sharing model work is a bit of a chicken and egg situation. We have to get data on board for people to use it. We have to get people to use it to get people to provide it. And so it's been a 6-year sort of labour of love, really. But we are getting substantial amounts of data in, and every piece of that data is really relevant to any service provider working with that individual. So that's probably all I want to say about VRS at the moment. We have done a recent survey, and I just thought it'd be interesting while we're talking about how to make sure we treat consumers in the right way to understand perhaps what they're saying about, particularly about vulnerability at the moment, and what their concerns are. So this is the backdrop really of what we're dealing with. And you'll see here, the good news, I guess, is that the amount of people considering themselves to be vulnerable, and I'm always aware that that word has a certain amount of stigma attached to it, but it is what we're using. The amount of people hasn't really gone up. Now, I suppose there's a couple of reasons for that. We haven't really seen the full impact of the cost of living crisis. When we did this same survey last year, we were just coming out of the throes of the pandemic. What's always interesting to me is that the older people get, the less they seem to identify as vulnerable, and that's significantly so. Now, there may be many reasons for that, but I think the one concern is really that the fact that the older people don't acknowledge themselves or recognize themselves as being vulnerable may be that things aren't highlighted, and we can't take that into consideration and perhaps treat them in that way. And I think the other thing is, we do work in a very digital world. There are communication methods that are very, very digital, and I think we are still probably not uncovering and identifying a lot of people who are vulnerable that should be. There's still a huge amount of people out there without smartphones. As I say, older people are less likely to use those digital channels. So I think we always need to be conscious of that. A lot of these people may not be highlighted on a credit report, on the financial radar. So we really need to make sure that they're not slipping through the net. The issues that people have highlighted in the last 12 months affecting them, and it continues to be predominantly mental health, general health issues, but obviously people coping with finances. Life events, I guess, are always going to come into play, whatever's happening in the economy. But of course, difficulty maintaining payments and difficulty communicating with service providers, all of those seem to be weighted towards women finding them more significant. I would say that the instances of all these events decrease the older the population. It's always going down. So 61% of those over 65 do not relate to any of those issues, as opposed to 36% overall. We're still seeing a lot of victims of fraud. We're still seeing gambling addiction and coercion being an issue, and that's the one area which seems to affect men, or they cite it as affecting men more than it does women. These are really taken, and we did this whole survey in light of some of the things the FCA have said, but again, this gives you an idea of the types of ways people consider themselves to be vulnerable, and you'll see typically the curve goes down as people get older. There's less chance, even with health, of people identifying as vulnerable as they get past 65. So it just shows that constant trend. I guess the only real couple of peaks there around resilience between 25 and 35, and life events for people between 35 and 44, and I think we can probably think of reasons why that would be the case. So how can we identify vulnerability? And I think one of the things that's clear coming out of Consumer Duty is firms need to consider the needs, characteristics and objectives of their consumers, and that includes those with characteristics of vulnerability. And I think one of the things with Consumer Duty, it's applicable to everybody. We're pulling out vulnerability, but a lot of this is common sense. We should treat our customers in the right way, whether they're sticking their hand up and saying they're vulnerable or not. The other thing that firms should do is avoid causing foreseeable harm and act in good faith. And if I can just say one thing about what we're doing with VRS in the database, if somebody is registered on the database, then and they are flagging that up, then that information can be used to prevent foreseeable harm. And there is really no reason why that shouldn't be taken into consideration. So, do we know who our vulnerable customers are? And I still get the same conversation repeatedly that I've had over the last 6 years with organisations that say, well, actually, we already know who all our vulnerable customers are. And I mean, I think it's the case that actually, no, you don't, and no, you can't. If 25% of the population are seeing themselves as vulnerable, then we can't possibly have a full view of who our vulnerable customers are. And I don't think we can be expected to do, but what we can be expected to do is to take steps to identify them, to take it into account when it is flagged up to us, and we will be accountable. We will have to be able to evidence that 27% of people consider themselves to be vulnerable. Now, not all of those people are going to want to tell us that they're vulnerable or want to flag it up, but certainly, again, looking at the survey that we did, 24% of the people that we surveyed are more than comfortable with flagging up their vulnerability, either if asked or proactively disclosing it. Now, it won't be relevant in all circumstances. It might only need to be disclosed occasionally, but people are generally comfortable with flagging that up. And again, these are some key stats that have come out of the survey that we did, and this is really what we're dealing with. And some of them are very frightening, and I don't think we need some sort of A star in A level to work out the volumes of people we're talking about here. 10%, and again, this is consistent over last year, 10% of people are worried about being repossessed, falling into homelessness, or have been evicted. That is a huge amount of the population that are sitting there worried whether they are going to be able to stay or keep their own home, which is going to be the overwhelming thought on those people's minds at every stage of the process. So I think that is probably the most stark facts that came out. I think last year I thought it was concerning. To have that repeated this year, I think is very, very worrying. And then some of the other figures I'll cover off. 2.25% have used the services of a loan shark, and we work with the illegal money lending team to ensure that where people are victims of loan sharks, it does appear on our database. So we do have that information sitting there. 8% missing mortgage or rental repayments, 8% of the population using food banks, 3.7% being threatened, I've put there, threatened with gas or electricity disconnection, and 4.3% are being moved to prepayment meters. And the other stats just back that up. So I don't think there's significant movements over last year, but I think we've certainly got enough to worry about as those figures stand at the moment. And I think the one thing I've learned through the process of working with VRS and moving things together, there is no master plan. There is no real sort of government body or individual or organisation spearheading the quest to draw together vulnerable information and to identify those who need the most support. The information is held in lots of disparate places. So there's nothing collectively that pulls everything together and also looks to see, okay, which people really should we be focusing on to make sure they're getting the right benefits, to make sure they're getting discounted tariffs, to make sure they've got the right advice available to them. Should they be on the priority service register with the with utilities? There's nothing collectively doing that. So I think one of our main challenges has been going to all those different sources, whether it be local government, whether it be solicitors, whether it be people like the illegal money lending team, Accommodation Concern, British Legion, loads of charities. If you think about all the areas that hold information about vulnerable people, what we've been trying to do is gradually harness that and pull it together so that we have a single view. So if we're waiting for somebody to say, this is what we all need to do, this is the plan, that there isn't one, or if there is, it's been kept very, very secret. And if we don't embrace data sharing, I think customers will always have to communicate their circumstances from scratch every time they speak to every single one of their service providers. And as I said, that can be water, that can be telecoms, that can be buy now, pay later, it can be anything. So I think it is incredibly important to embrace it. We will have no way of effectively providing the right support to those who need it most, because we have no collective way of identifying them unless we pull data sharing together. And therefore, there will be no way of effectively helping customers achieve the right outcomes, which is what the FCA are asking them, because we cannot identify what is making them financially vulnerable. And if we don't know that, if we don't know what's causing the problem, then we really can't help them achieve those outcomes. There is no mandate to share a lot of the information that we're collecting at the moment. It is unique data. So we are where we are. So we have a database. It is not as huge as I would like it to be, but equally, we don't want 50% of everybody's customers putting their hands up and saying we're vulnerable and we need to be treated differently. So what we have is a database of individuals that I believe should be taken into account when organisations are working with them. And the data is telling us these different things. It's telling us about financial hardship when it is influenced by other circumstances such as mental health or a life event. It's showing the propensity for customers to become more seriously indebted and fall victim to unregulated lending. There isn't a big gap between regulated lending and people becoming the victims of loan sharks or being a victim of coercion. We show if people are affected by mental, physical health, life events, or accessibility. So it may be that they need communicating differently. We also hold data about individuals that are deceased, and that usually appears on our database in a far more timely fashion than it takes to actually appear on a mortality register. So obviously there's a risk of those deceased identity fraud, because it's appearing in a timely manner. Then there's a lot less damage likely to be done. And importantly, we also show where individuals' financial affairs are being managed by a third party, and very often where they should not be accepted for any credit, and it will reflect that because they are subject to a court of protection order, for example, and they are lacking the mental capacity to manage their own financial affairs. They can't repay that. We can actually display that up front. So I think one of the big things that has come out when I've talked to organisations of any size and many sectors, it's all very well as identity, but what do we actually do when we've identified it? There is no rule book around how we treat people. We need to work out what to do, and often that can be a barrier for us to actually wanting to identify vulnerability, because we actually don't know what to do with it. But I think what we have done is we've created this sort of corporate world where it's full of digital channels and call routing, and that makes us very efficient, and it works most of the time. But what it doesn't always do is work for people who are in vulnerable positions. While it can work for most, and we shouldn't strip that away, we need to unpick it a little bit and see what actually works for the vulnerable population. And just because somebody is vulnerable, it doesn't actually mean that we've got to do a full diagnosis on them or come up with some sort of prescription about how they should be treated. At the end of the day, when somebody's vulnerable, what we need to be working out is how that impacts their relationship with us as a service provider. And in some cases, it might not be relevant, and we have to identify when and where it is. And that it's likely to just simply be impacting in the way that you communicate with those individuals, or indeed their ability to pay. And it probably really just comes down to those two areas. If they're vulnerable, okay, how does that affect the way we communicate with them? How does that affect the way that their contract with us is going to be fulfilled? And in many cases, we can just quite simply ask them, if we're identifying on our database that somebody is in financial hardship, or that's been picked up, or they've stopped paying, if that's coupled with a life event, or if it's coupled with an illness or a mental health situation, then quite simply we can potentially ask that person, what can we do to make sure that we are managing that relationship properly? And then furthermore, a lot of this is really common sense, and we just need to create this framework to understand how to treat people. And we are certainly, as VRS, we are working with organisations, and we are building that framework. We're running some training sessions around this next month. There's a link there. I'll also put it in the chat. And I know all the other speakers today are doing the same sort of things. We're very aware that there is a challenge here around there's lots of different types of vulnerability. People react to things in different ways. How do we treat them? How do we help them? And how do we stay efficient as a business while we're doing that? As I say, a lot of this is common sense. So maybe we don't send 85-year-olds typically down the digital channel. It might not be the best way to deal with the majority of them. If somebody's got is a carer for somebody and they phone us up, and again going back to our survey, 45% of the people we surveyed are acting on somebody else's behalf when they're talking to a service provider. Maybe the best way when somebody's phoning up on somebody else's behalf when they've sat in a call queue for 20 minutes is not to say, well, we can't help you, and repeat data protection 20 times. Perhaps they haven't got the person sitting next to them who they're caring for waiting to authenticate the call and make sure that the person can progress. Maybe it's better to say, let's arrange a time to talk to you. Let's not say we can't help you and send them away to spend another 20 minutes further down in a call queue. Maybe, you know, when we're looking at people who have suffered from economic abuse or financial coercion, maybe it's best to look at that on a case-by-case basis, and okay, we are writing off the debt in some instance, but we're also leaving the information so that the credit history is shot to pieces for the next 6 years. That doesn't make sense, and it really doesn't work for anybody. And I think we also have to look, you know, at the circumstances. If somebody is citing the fact that they've got a mental health situation coupled with financial difficulty, then really we need to pick that up as early as possible and not be reaching the point where we're sending them endless letters asking for payment, hounding them with calls and texts that really they're not in a position to respond to. So that's where we are. That's VRS, food for thought. But what I'm going to do now is hand over to Simon Gregory at Data on Demand. What I'd also stress, and I'm sure Simon will cover this, data on demand, hold data, VRS, hold data. We work together to make sure that we can capitalise on that data together. And if organisations want to use both of us, then we'll make sure that that's provided in the most streamlined way possible. So I shall stop sharing and pass over to Simon.
Perfect. Thanks, Helen. So just double checking then before I start that everybody can see the presentation. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yes, as Helen said, nice to be invited along today, guys. I'm Simon Gregory from Data on Demand. The focus for the session today, and where I wanted to try and focus our presentation, is kind of moving that kind of policy statement that we now all have and are very aware of from the FCA into the practice of actually identifying vulnerable customers. So for those of you who are not aware of us and haven't come across Data on Demand as of yet, we're an alternative provider of UK consumer data. That data is mainly captured through online application journeys, and it's delivered to businesses with end relationships with consumers with a focus on trying to provide or help them to provide better customer outcomes. So we'll keep the focus on sort of financial services today, but worth mentioning, as Helen said at the start, this is transferable across a number of different sectors. And I've just listed a couple of the ones: utilities, public sector, gaming, etc., that we're starting to see a lot of engagement with as well. So our data can be used right across the customer life cycle, from onboarding right the way through to risk decisioning, customer management, and into collections and recoveries as well. But today I'll keep the focus, again, just given the audience and the title of the session, on how we can help FCA regulated businesses. And the main area there is the identification and monitoring of the consumer vulnerability. So Andrew's already done a very good job of highlighting some of the key aspects of consumer duty, but just a very kind of simple high-level view from our side. Consumer duty is building on the principles of treating customers fairly. The key focus that we see, and we're talking to a lot of our clients about at the moment, is being able to assess and monitor vulnerability, not just at the point that you actually onboard a new customer, but also during that full life cycle of the relationship that you have with them. So I think the conversation that we keep having with clients and keep hearing mentioned by the regulator and other people and know is that you can no longer take the view on your kind of current customer base that just because they are happily paying their installments, that there is no potential change in circumstance and no potential vulnerability there. So the onus is now very much that you need to be proactive as a service provider in monitoring and understanding changes in circumstances for your customer base. So happy, and as Helen said, we'll share these slides and happy to have kind of separate conversations, but a high level introduction. So ID View is a service that we created, and a database we created back in early 2020. So it collates data from subprime and high cost short-term loan applications, but it also takes in data from our partnership with the VRS. So we've got a kind of combined data set there, which looks at data captured from loan applications, but also self-declared declarations through the VRS database. It was initially and still is built to help firms align with the guidelines set out by the regulator. And it looks at high-level segmentation of vulnerability in line with regulatory requirements, but also then digs into over 100 different kind of unique characteristics and variables at the moment, which are all, again, aligned back to the drivers and characteristics of vulnerability that the regulators identified. Volume-wise, currently, we're just over 3.3 million UK consumers, but it's a transient data set. We refresh our databases daily. We capture our data in live via API. So that data set is continuously moving, as you would expect. So what I've tried to look at today, thinking back to that kind of title point of, okay, we can talk about the theoretical idea of how we do things, but how can we actually start to put that into practice? So the extract you've got here is an example from a portfolio analysis that we ran with a fairly standard unsecured consumer finance provider. The question in terms of how gets asked quite a lot, how do we do this? How quickly can we put it in place? So I've just listed out as well the sort of process that we go through to run this type of analysis. Very simply, that is obviously an amount of due diligence on both parties' side. We'll agree a data processing agreement to transfer the data to and from you as a client. We'll provide a full data input specification. We will also provide you with the means to upload that data securely. Once we have that data, we will go through a PEM process to match and identify the kind of trends and vulnerability characteristics that we can identify. And then we'll then provide that back, not just looking at the kind of raw data variables, but we'll also look to provide a kind of exec summary level insight as well. So given times, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, and the slides will be shared. But just to give you an idea then, so this portfolio, 90 million odd portfolio, unsecured consumer finance, what we looked at within there is total accounts, but we also looked at in the green columns, the volume and value of the live accounts. In the orange columns, we looked at the arrears portfolio, again, volume and value. And interesting, in the blue, we also looked at business that had just been underwritten. So if you look onto the left-hand side, we've got at the top there, 20% of that portfolio across the entire segment there were identified as having some form of characteristic which is associated with the regulatory characteristics and drivers. Would expect to see a decent number of those in the arrears portfolio. The interesting thing that we're able to provide insight on is also the number of those that again are sitting in that kind of active, happily paying, no concerns as far as the lender in question is aware of. And then if you look down into some of the detail there, we've also got a number of people who we've highlighted as being highly vulnerable. So talking about those kind of high-level segments that we look at, we split those into highly vulnerable, currently vulnerable, and historically vulnerable. Again, the interesting piece for us was the number of people we were able to identify, either accounts that have just been written or accounts that are happily live and paying, where you do have that kind of insight into the levels of and characteristics of vulnerability. We also, talking about the partnership with the BRS as well, again, very interesting that we have a number of live accounts who are already registered with BRS. And these are people who are saying, we are in a vulnerable circumstance, and that's something that the lender in question had no idea about. The other point I wanted to make here is, I think there can be an amount of kind of trepidation from some lenders of wanting to do this type of analysis, because they can have the feeling that 50–60% of my customer book is going to be highlighted as vulnerable to me, and then what do I do about that? Well, I think it's all proportional. So the FCA have made it clear that proportionality is going to be a key part of it. And the way that we've approached that is, you've got that kind of 20% marker for this portfolio, but it's completely down to you as a lender to look at those high-level markers, but also the kind of more granular items to work out for your strategy, what's the important points that you want to monitor for your customer book. Again, happily, we are encouraging all lenders to run these type of evaluations with us, and we're more than happy to do this. But just to kind of take it down to that next level then, so that last slide was looking at the high level insights that we were able to provide in the portfolio. Some of the kind of granular detail we're able to get down into is looking at some of these kind of key triggers and variables. So I've pulled out a few here. You've got a reduction in monthly income. We've got a change in employment status. So people who are going through application processes who we've previously seen as stating they are employed, who circumstances have changed. We've got specific types of loan application. So purposeful for the loan. If you've got somebody again who's happily paying their monthly commitments to you, but actually in the background they've just made an application for some form of subprime or high cost loan to pay their bills, that very much ties in with the kind of cost of living crisis at the moment and is a key indicator. And then we've also got a couple of really strong indicators, I think, that we see within portfolios, which is new loan applicants. So people who have perhaps previously been maybe accessing more prime types of finance, who are now finding themselves in a position where they need to go through the kind of subprime route, and also change to relationship status, another key driver of vulnerability. So we're able to identify people who are newly divorced, newly separated, etc., through their application data. Finally, just for consumption point of view, there's three key ways that we usually engage with clients. API, more than happy for people to take that data through the live API that exists. Monthly batch uploads, so we can provide new monitoring on a monthly basis to clients. We do that via secure transfer. And we also provide a hosted monitoring service. So we take client books and we can provide real-time updates on changing circumstance to customers on a daily basis as well. And for those under the age of 30, that icon on the right is a floppy disk, which you may have never seen before. So that's it. I think I've hopefully not done too bad with the timing, Helen. If anybody wants to find out more, certainly ask questions now, but visit the website or reach out to me. Email address is on there, and always happy to engage with people.
Thanks, Simon. That's brilliant. And again, if you want to put any questions in the chat, please do so, and we'll pick them up in a few minutes after Joseph's done his presentation. So if I can, I'll hand over to Joseph Twig from Avini, and I think this is a slightly different slant on the whole aspect of identifying vulnerability, and looks at speech analytics and AI and so on. And again, I'd stress that the paper I've put the link to at the beginning of the chat, we've all had input into that, so it's probably worth downloading that if you're interested. Okay, I'll pass over to you, Joseph. Thank you.
Thanks, Helen. So I'm Joseph Twig, the CEO of Aveni. We're an AI company focused largely on natural language processing. We work with large financial services companies, large utilities companies, to help automate the assessment of customer interactions. So we're very much focused on that customer contact space, what your customers are saying, how your agents or advisors are dealing with your customers, and automating process around all of that. I should say the way we work, we don't try and automate humans out of a process. We try and make humans as efficient and as effective as they can be. And that's coined under this phrase human plus. So we wrap technology around the way that people work to leverage the best of both AI, machine learning, and human. Right, let's go into how this technology works. You have to bear with me a minute here. You probably weren't expecting this slide when you turned up today, but I think it's important for people to sort of understand exactly how this tech works. So in terms of how it starts with a customer conversation that can be face-to-face recorded. It can be a telephone, it can be a video call. It can also be any other channel that you have, web chat, email, any sort of text-based channel. When it's audio, we take the data, we take the audio file, we convert that to text, and we convert that to text using specially trained automated speech recognition models that use custom language models. So we're identifying key terms and nomenclature. Then we work with different business areas to train the models to do specific things. So to bring that to life, we worked with a large UK financial services organisation. Within their collections and recoveries team, we took maybe over 10,000 of their audio recordings, and we trained models to identify different aspects of customer vulnerability. So what the customer's saying, how they're saying it, are they hesitating, what's their tone, and then organize the output within the guidance on FG 21.1 around health, life events, resilience, etc., enabling that company to have an assessment, an additional assessment of customer vulnerability over and above what their agents identify. So second line of defense, if you will. So when models are trained, we extract the information that we're looking for. So in the case I just highlighted, that would be the segment of the call or the interaction related to the vulnerability. Then we label that, and then we can automate workflows. So in the case of vulnerability, you're maybe assessing the risk automatically, and then flagging to either a quality assurance professional or a vulnerability champion that an interaction has just occurred that they should maybe take a look at. You can also assess whether appropriate advice was given or the appropriate next best actions were given based on the vulnerability that occurred. The key thing about any sort of artificial intelligence or machine learning is getting models that work and work well. So we have a process called human in the loop, whereby anytime a user of the platform, so a vulnerability champion or assessor or a trainer uses our platform learns from the interactions. So It will take feedback and automatically train models from that feedback. And then all of the output, this is super important from a consumer duty perspective, all of the output in our system is near live. So within a few seconds or a minute of a call ending, all of this processing is done, all the machine assessments done, and all the reports are updated. So you can get reports across your whole population pretty much live, which takes a lot of pain out of typical reporting processes. So how do we use all of that? Just one second. How do we use all of that in terms of sort of business process? So we like to think we're creating a central nervous system. So where a quality assurance function may have in a prior life or currently maybe sort of thinking back questions, we're actually enabling multiple functions from across the business with a whole new paradigm of insight and automation. So that could be the way a product's sold. What's the agent said? How have they said it? If they, been a little bit too forceful, did they use the tenor and tone required of them? We automatically identify training opportunities. So maybe a mandatory statement was missed or not read correctly. Maybe a vulnerability was missed. Our algorithms identify those calls and flag them to individuals and their managers, so they can use those calls for training. We can also link that back to underlying training materials, so your agents and advisors can self-serve and improve themselves. Outcome testing or compliance testing, quality assurance. One of the core strengths of this type of technology is automating that type of assessment. So what we typically find at the moment, not in all cases, but what we typically find is you have relatively large teams of human assessors doing quality assurance over a tiny fraction of the total population of calls, so maybe 1%, 2%. We can essentially create a machine assessment that will monitor all of the calls if you'd like, or 10, 20, 30% of calls, and then triage the high risk calls into that human team. So they're always looking at high value interactions that the business can learn from or that the customer will benefit from. We automatically identify complaints, expressions of dissatisfaction, and we can do that against different vulnerability types, different product types, etc. This can be fed back, all of this information fed back into product development or product governance, which I think will become increasingly important in a consumer duty world. And as I mentioned previously, we have methods of automatically identifying potential vulnerabilities for customers, which, especially when you get into large contact center environments with, tens or hundreds of thousands of interactions per month, having this sort of machine assessment that can look across the whole population is super valuable to make sure that nothing's being missed. So just bringing this back to consumer duty. As Andrew was saying at the outset, lots of activities underway at the moment from a consumer duty perspective. We sort of consider that in these three buckets of activity. Currently, companies are defining what the new consumer duty requirements mean for their business, their products, and their customer journeys. So going across the whole product life cycle, and for each customer journey within that product life cycle, identifying the cross-cutting rules and defining what those cross-cutting rules are. So what exactly is a good outcome for this product? What exactly could cause harm for this customer with this product? This is a huge exercise to really truly understand how harm can emerge what a good outcome is, and to understand that across all the different permutations that each customer has, whether it's, you know, going through an online only channel, whether they're receiving post and communications that way. You know, real thought has to be made in each of these steps to ensure these cost-cutting rules are properly understood. When you've understood, you've defined the cost-cutting rules, and you've understood what exactly you're looking for, you have to design a governance framework. And that governance framework is essentially responsible for validating that the company is doing exactly what it says it's doing. Now, this again can be a huge task. You've got multiple different functions in play, typically with fragmented technology, and they all need to point to the same thing. Was this customer's outcome good, given the journey that customer's taken with us as a business? And I think, as both Simon and Andrew mentioned, the key challenge with this is, and I think a shift in mindset is going beyond the point of sale. So this is not just, right, they were fine when they bought this product because we did our fact find, we did our assessment, we did our risk assessment, and they were fine. The question is, are they fine now? Will they be fine next year? And you need to, companies need to understand the suitability of products through a whole customer lifetime. And I think that's a real shift in mindset. So, you know, there's a constant exercise of revalidating the suitability of products over time. I think one, again, just reflecting what's been mentioned previously, what this type of governance framework will do is generate a whole new raft of data. And one of the big challenges, I think, in number one, creating a governance framework that can identify that data and report against that data, is existing frameworks are not scalable. So the traditional 3 lines of defense model, the first line is the business line, the second line in the sort of assessment and support functions like compliance, risk, and the third line being internal audit. With a human-centric approach, scaling that model is nigh on impossible. So if you now need to look at a higher number of your customer interactions to validate and demonstrate that your consumer duty framework is delivering good outcomes, in the existing approach, you just need to layer people on. I mean, this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but at the same time, you know, especially for medium or large companies, the scalability is a critical challenge. So the way we think about this, and what we think companies need to do, is to introduce a machine line of defense to their 3 lines of defense model. Effectively, this is a layer of artificial intelligence and machine learning that will assess pretty much every interaction if that's what companies want, and then triage the output into human teams. That way you get a base level of assurance across your whole population of calls. You can get an automated machine assessment on how your outcome framework is performing, whether customer outcomes are good, the emergence of harm, how you're treating vulnerable customers. That can all be channeled back to the first line of defense in terms of product and service feedback, coaching opportunities for staff. We can automate second line activity, enabling the triage of high priority cases to human teams, and we can enable the third line of defense. So provide auditors with the data and the direction to do meaningful thematic assessments across a population of calls. I think this will become increasingly essential for businesses to effectively monitor and identify customer vulnerability, good outcomes, harm, etc. So I think I've got a couple of minutes left, just looking at how some of this information is presented back in our system. So here we essentially see a chart breaking down vulnerable customers by different teams. So we can break down customer vulnerability by health, by capability, life events, resilience. And this can really, where we see this really being used and being used effectively is for the now emerged role of vulnerability champion within an organization. So the individual responsible for this, for organizing the vulnerable customer activity within a business. So they will typically have a dashboard, can see on a daily, weekly basis, high risk interactions that have come, that have happened in that last week, and can drill into each of these different areas to literally go to the point, go to the individual customer interaction, the point in the call where the vulnerability has been identified, and to assess whether the agent dealt with that appropriately, and the customer's outcome will be as intended. As mentioned, we also identify complaints and expressions of dissatisfaction. I think this is, again, going to be super important going forward. Typically, what we've seen, and the FCA have mentioned this multiple times, is companies place a gross over-reliance on complaints data. Will point to a low number of complaints as an indication of highly satisfied customer base, which is obviously not the case. There's a huge population of your customers that may be dissatisfied with the service, but may be apathetic and may not want to complain. They don't want to go through the process. So capturing these expressions of dissatisfaction against the reason for the dissatisfaction, that could be a negative sentiment to pricing, that could be a change in circumstances that's not been properly acknowledged or dealt with. This is going to be a super important source of information that points the needle towards good outcomes or the emergence of harm across an organization. As previously, as I mentioned near the beginning, one of the core things we do is auto QA. So this is a machine assessment. This can be customized. So your own existing QA process can be automated through model training. We have lots of off-the-shelf models, but what you get in effect, every time you look at a customer interaction, there is an assessment by the machine, and we've graded by Aveni. We've passed these. You may disagree with the machine assessment, and we can incorporate that in automated feedback. But every single interaction is assessed by the machine. And I think last but not least, I'll just touch on this very, very briefly. Another area that the FCA have really sort of pointed out is training, and moving beyond this mindset of we have an effective training regime. All of our staff do X number of exams or different training courses. Moving beyond pointing to that to, well, show us it works. So show us, prove to us that your staff are actually carrying that training into their interactions. With a technology like this, you can literally assess every interaction, how agents perform, did they execute their training, and feedback on very specific points. And yeah, I'll leave it there. I've run out of time.
That's really great. Thank you, Joseph. Much appreciated. Right, so we're going to just have a quick Q&A session. If anybody's got anything burning they want to ask, then can you raise a hand, and between us we'll try and see who's got anything to ask. In the meantime, Simon, there's a lot of discussion been going on in the chat. Do you want to pick up on that and anything that needs answering for me?
Yeah, there is. We've had quite a lot of questions and comments and points made. The first one, I think, in case anyone didn't catch it in the chat, was for Simon. Sarah asked about how do you decide who's highly vulnerable. I think was it 5% in your slide were highly vulnerable, and just wanted to break down to that, please.
Yeah, that's fine. So I put a quick answer in there, but basically from our side, so we use a scoring system to identify customers that will fall into either the highly vulnerable categorization, the currently vulnerable, or historically vulnerable. And that's built basically looking at how recent the characteristics we've identified were captured, and also how many of them have been captured as well. So happy to pick up separately with people and kind of go into detail on that, but broadly, it's looking at the frequency and recency of the vulnerability characteristics that have been triggered.
Okay, thanks, Simon. I think that covers it. There was another question, I think, for Joseph. What about non-obvious vulnerabilities that may not typically be picked up? Something that we considered a phone glitch, e.g. an intermittent stutter caused by a neurological issue, might come across as a glitch on the line and they can otherwise converse without issue. So Joseph, are you able to address that one at all, please?
Well, I think it's important to say that this is like no technology is like a silver bullet. It won't be accurate 100% of the time, and that's really why one of the primary reasons why we operate in this human plus setting. So, you know, we do a machine assessment and triage that into human assessment, because you can't rely on it 100% of the time. So, and one thing we found through several exercises with quite large UKFS firms, going through the machine assessment and comparing it in painful detail to human assessment, is human assessors often disagree. So on the same point. So it's definitely not a silver bullet, but it's a way to really scale your operations and focus your operation towards the higher risk interactions.
All right, great, thank you. Yeah, a couple more. So there was a questions around GDPR and around sharing of the data, so Carolyn responded with some really good links, and it was interesting to read that the ICO are kind of more and more sort of pro sharing the data and encouraging a few different programs on that. So there's some links in the chat if anyone wants to access that. But broadly speaking, you've got explicit consent, which everyone's kind of aware of and rely on. But then there's also something called special category data, where if it's beneficial to preserve someone's sort of economic well-being, you can share the data without relying on explicit consent. But as I say, the information's in the chat box there. There's some really useful links that Carolyn's added there. Pamela asked everyone, and I think this is a real sort of meta point, if you like, was discussing, can we discuss how we define good outcome? So does this mean not in debt, not promoting or cross-selling, etc.? Carolyn had a great answer, which was kind of ask the customer, and then there's been some subsequent points saying, well, but the customer may not be happy with the outcome, even though it's the right outcome. So does anyone want to sort of field this kind of, I'm giving you a bit of a hospital pass here, but anyone want to field this one around what a good outcome looks like? How do you measure it? Who can say whether it's a good outcome, and so on? Joseph, you're currently on my screen, but I don't want to pick on you.
Well, you did. I think, you know, the devil's in the detail here. I don't think you can just, with a very sort of broad brush, define what a good outcome is. I think it depends on the product. It depends on the type, the nature of the financial service or the nature of the service. It depends on the customer. It depends on their circumstances. It's really complicated. And one really big challenge within consumer duty, and potentially within the fair treatment of vulnerable customers, is sort of benchmarking. So if Barclays define a good outcome one way, and HSBC define a good outcome for a similar product a different way, who's right, who's wrong? So I think over time, what we're going to see is a degree of consensus emerging on definitions for different products, different product lines, different sectors, and I think over time the FCA will back different definitions, and it'll become clear. I think at the moment it's just not clear.
Simon, can I jump in on this?
Yeah, gladly. Great answer, by the way, Joseph. Thank you. Yeah, go on, Andrew.
Yeah, so I think the FCA has this concept of proportionality, and I think we should look at it more on the point of view of avoiding bad outcomes. So bad outcomes, I think, is like, you know, people being evicted from the house, people paying far too much money on their interest rates, people not being paid out on their insurance on insurance when they thought they should. So, and I think those are what really the FCA is after. So, the first point I think is there are lots of areas in the industry. We'll all look at them and say, well, that's a bad outcome from the customer, and those are the ones we want to focus on and remove. Over time, then we may start getting into, well, okay, what's good? There's no need for financial firms, to start paying everyone so everyone's got lots of money. I mean, that's, everyone's happy from that point of view. What we're trying to remove, what the FCA is trying to remove, is to remove those really, really bad outcomes, which were avoidable. So people will, for example, will invest in stocks and shares and they will go down. Well, as long as the customer knew that, they had an attitude for loss, that's fine. You wouldn't describe that as a good outcome, but that's a fair outcome for that person in what they were doing, investing in those stocks and shares. On the other hand, because there's an element of risk in investing in stocks and shares. On the other hand, if the person didn't really understand what they were doing, or it's totally inappropriate for them to doing that, and they were maybe had a history of gambling, and that wasn't found out, then you say, well, that's a really bad outcome, because if you knew that person was a history of gambling or a gambling addict, you could have stopped that. You could have really stopped that at the time and reduced their ability to go into something which was going to go up and down. So I think just using a bit of common sense and saying, well, it's the old adage, would I sell this to my cousin? How would I treat my mother? Is that fair? When we're just looking to try and remove those bad those really bad outcomes. Does that help?
Well, it helps me, Andrew. I think it was an excellent answer. Thank you. But so thanks for that. There's loads more comments in the chat and people sort of debating, but I've got a couple more questions. I think these ones are primarily for Helen. So Jenny asked, if someone's registered with the VRS by an organisation, is the individual able to request they're taken off the register, or does it need to come from the organisation that registered them in the first place?
It depends on the circumstances. So obviously, if a entry is predicated on consent, then the individual can get that information removed. I think the difference really is when an organisation is acting on a person's behalf. So when we talk about a local authority, for example, having a court of protection order, and they are acting on that individual's behalf and they have authority, then we would take the authority or the request from the local authority in those interests, because it is the protection of the individual that's at stake.
Thank you, Helen. And then finally, because I'm conscious we're slightly
Sarah's got her hands up as well. I can see in
Oh, I'm sorry. Right there. So Nicole said she's curious if a customer has an addiction flag, could this addiction flag registered on the VRS, could this impact their ability to obtain further credit and can provide a search?
I mean that's something you know, there's always been forefront of our mind throughout VRS. We aren't operating a screening, this is a vulnerable person, don't give them credit service. It's the rules, the contracts, the auditing we do is all focused on ensuring that, you know, it doesn't act as a automatic auto decline situation. Having said that, if somebody says I've got a gambling addiction, I haven't got any money, and you do an open banking check that says any money they've got is spent on gambling, then your decision is probably going to be turn them down. But yeah, it shouldn't be solely VRS flag turned down. Yeah, so Sarah.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, Sarah. I think you're on mute, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, got you. Thank you.
Just a really general one relating kind of off the back of what I asked Joseph. What about non-standard vulnerabilities? Because a lot of what we've seen today focuses on traditional metrics of health, life crisis, etc. What about the way COVID-19 has reshaped the way people are classed as vulnerable? You know, we had a whole category of people who were clinically extremely vulnerable, who normally wouldn't be considered vulnerable. That's been changed to basis on symptoms, etc. People have now got long-term issues off the back of COVID. People have long COVID. You know, what would traditionally be classed as a metric for health would be, you know, somebody's disabled. You know, someone could have a condition where they're upwardly mobile, functional to first glance. You never ever think there's anything wrong with them, but they are vulnerable. What do we need to be looking for outside of the traditional metrics of age, life status, that kind of thing, so that we can understand there are people who are in between those categories who are vulnerable as well?
Okay, shall I take that, Simon? I think you're right. I think we've always had a challenge about how to what granular a detail do you go to in identifying or defining vulnerability, and I don't think anybody can successfully do that unless you actually almost do a case study on each individual. We did go down the route of using a COVID flag for that, you know, whole to encompass the long COVID and all the different things that came along with COVID that weren't expected. I can't say it was used that significantly. I also think that would be relevant in certain situations. We also went down the route of, you know, we've got a load of vulnerable people, supermarket people, do you want to sort of look at those to prioritize them? So there is a bit of that, but I think on the whole, and our flags are dynamic, we can change them, we're flexible, we can increase them, but I think they probably encompass most of those areas. Physical health would encompass most of them, and I think it goes back to what I said earlier. In certain circumstances, you can't just go an automated customer journey route. You have to interact with the consumer and you have to ask them the question, I suppose, and gauge how that's going to impact them. Anyway, thank you very much. We're just spot on time actually at the moment, so if we have 15 minutes break, get yourself a coffee or whatever, and we'll come back at 11:15. Thanks for your attention so far. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. I'm going to hand over to Andrew Gething again from Morgan Ash, who we're getting our money's worth out of today, who is going to put his Morgan Ash head on now and talk from that perspective.
Thanks, Helen. Welcome back, everyone. Hope you've got your tea or coffee. So let me just share my screen. Excellent. So hopefully you can see that. So I'm now going to talk a bit about Morgan Ash and our solution to this, and hopefully following on from all the good work we've heard so far. So just a bit of background about us. So we are we've been around for now 18 years. We've been assessing health of consumers for financial services, for things like life insurance and pensions. We look after ill people. I have a clinical team, mostly of nurses. We look after lots of ill people, be they claiming on insurance or off work for whatever reason. We are FCA regulated and regulated for arranging and administering investments and insurance. And indeed, obviously, we're compliant with GDPR, which obviously makes managing medical data a bit more tricky. So IS 27000, Cyber Essentials, and so forth. And also we provide multiple service for many UK insurance intermediaries and so forth. So that's our background. Next slide is actually talk about FCA stuff, which we've already done in my earlier piece. So I wanted now to jump into what we consider our philosophy. And there's a core piece really underneath thing, which is a lot of what we talk about if people are vulnerable or not. And we don't think that's very helpful. Vulnerability to us is not binary, it's a range. If you take someone who has, for example, a hearing aid, would you describe them as vulnerable or not vulnerable? We'd probably all agree that if someone was totally deaf, they would be vulnerable. But at what point do you describe them as vulnerable or not vulnerable? And we think that's not useful, and hence we don't do that. So nowhere will you in our software will you see someone as mandated as vulnerable or not vulnerable. What we have is a range. The second big principle is that of how we assess people, and a lot of assessment at the moment is being done subjectively by individuals, and that can be broken down into is that person vulnerable for that circumstance. So they may be considering saying, well, I've actually spoken to them, I've spoken to their colleague, I've spoken to their family, for example. We've overcome any vulnerabilities, so they're not vulnerable. So they're thinking the outcome is not vulnerable, and then they record them as not vulnerable. We like to break that down. We break it down into understanding the customer characteristics and the circumstances. So it may be that customer characteristics, for example, they live in a floodplain, which would mean they're vulnerable with regard to utility company, but not for financial services firm. So it's important to understand what we call the customer characteristics, and they can be health, life events, wealth, and financial capability, all those good things. So we break that down into understanding those, and generally those what we call customer characteristics are generally facts. How we assess those then, we need to be more objective in how we're doing that. People who have already started doing assessments subjectively, and people have added vulnerability flags to CRM systems and so forth. And that's all good, but what they complain is then it's inconsistent. And what one person considers vulnerable is not the same as the other. Now you can overcome that by training, but that is quite a big challenge, especially if you've got to cover everyone in the organization. So we now to look at it and say, okay, we need an objective method so we can measure characteristics across. And Sarah, your point about all those different variances of non-standard vulnerabilities, absolutely. We try and cover every single contributor to vulnerability that we can. And indeed, I'm sure there are ones we haven't come across yet, but we can include in there. So we've created, and we've been working on this now for many years, I think over 5 years. We created what we call a resilience rating. And resilience rating is essentially a crude assessment of consumer characteristics, and you think of it just like a credit score. So a credit score is a relatively crude assessment of someone's wealth or debt, and is used by financial services essentially to protect financial services from people who don't have any money. A resilience rating we're using as a relatively crude assessment of a consumer characteristics, and we use the word consumer characteristics there as opposed to vulnerability, but you could intertwine them. And we're using that to give a quick view of where is that person on that resilience scale. It's relatively simple in that a resilience rating of 10 we'd consider as very resilient, and a resilience rating of 1 is very vulnerable. And indeed, we have all the descriptions in between that. Once you have that as objective, you can then collect your data, and we can then assess people from multiple different places at multiple different times. Oops. So how do we do that? So the tool itself, we can take in data from any source. One of the aims of the tool is that we need to be able to ensure we have coverage of every single person we're dealing with. So from our financial services firm, I can ping off to VRS, and we do that. That's integrated the tool. I can work with Avini to get data from the call center. I can work with data on demand to get data they've pulled in, but I need to get coverage of every single person, or at least attempt to get coverage. So a very simple thing we do is we can send a questionnaire to the consumer, and they can complete that. That's an online secure questionnaire. I can also have the advisor or the agent, they can complete that if they're talking to them. Or in the case where we know that person is already probably vulnerable, and particularly where in the older generation of dementia, then we can ask one of our nurses to do that assessment. So we have different methods. There's no right or wrong from that point of view. Every assessment is open to bias. There is problems in all of these, in that if you go to the customer, they may not tell you. The agent themselves may be biased if they're on commission. So there's problems in all of them. The main thing is to start collecting those and understand that data. So once we've got that data, we then that goes into the engine, goes in the algorithms, and then we produce what we call a characteristic report, which then is available to download, and that gives you then essentially a rating. So I'm on the wrong screen. Let me just go down here. A rating, which we display in a couple of different ways. So we display that as this graph there that you see at the top. Now that you probably can't see it, but the top one is health. So this person is scoring 4 out of 10 on their health. The wealth bar there you see is actually missing. And quite often in our situation, in practice, we'll be working with firms who already have some sort of assessment of their debt or their wealth. That be maybe using IE Hub, who'll be talking afterwards, or they already have some affordability metrics they already do. So they can use those. The point is, the point I want to make here is that the rating can be used with any information at any time. You don't have to have all the information to complete it. So for example, you may not have a record of a particular person. They phone in and tell you that they've just got divorced and they're in a complete mess. So you could have just a rating on the life events, which, you know, in that situation would probably be down at the 2 or 3 level. and that is enough. That's, you know, if you know that information, you collected that information, then that is really useful. So the objective resilience rating is generated from any source, no matter where that's come from, and then we display it a bit like a credit score. The next stage is we produce a certificate, which highlights that, and also that recommends treatments. So we call them treatments. They're essentially next steps. So what do you do in that circumstance? So most firms will have some sort of policy which says, if this person is blind, then we should send them information in Braille, or don't send them letters, you know, phone them instead. You know, simple things like that. I mean, that's an obvious one, but there may be different ones. For example, you may say if someone has a gambling addiction, then we would do double checks before putting them in high risk investments. And those can be set by the company and their policy, and essentially the risk appetite from a conduct risk point of view for that company and what they want to do. I think it's an important point here that we're not just talking about the very vulnerable, but also talking about what I could consider more like customer service issues. So someone, for example, who has a hearing aid, who actually or wears glasses like myself, you know, am I vulnerable? Well, I have a slight sight impediment. I wear glasses. That overcomes my issue. But so there are lots of areas where we have, well, you know, a slight issue, but we wouldn't consider us as necessarily as vulnerable, but are in that customer service area. And you may want to how you interact with them change depending on understanding their characteristics. And so this comes into this other area of personalization, about managing your communication and managing how you work with people, to having more understanding of them. So it's not just about vulnerability from that point of view. We produce that certificate because we need to, from an FCA point of view, to show that what we have done. The next point then is, or the next stage for us, is how we monitor that throughout the product's lifespan. And the little graph there at the top left is every time we interact or we have any data, we record that and record that on that score. So the little graph there says, oh, that person was fine, but then actually things have gone really bad. And that is relatively simplistic. But what it then tells you is saying, okay, I need to know, I really need to understand what that is. And you would then drill down into the tool and sort of say, okay, is this a health issue? Is this a wealth issue? Is it some customer understanding? What is it which is that causing that problem? And from that, you can decide then what to do. The whole principle of this is because it's at a high level resilience rating, you can share that throughout the organization without any fear from a GDPR point of view. So only people who really need to know could go down and see that. So you may say anyone in the company can see, you know, if you take a large organization, can see that score, see that rating, but not everyone will be able to see what that is, that it is a mental health issue, or they've just got divorced or what have you. Only those people who need to know that would have access to that level of detail. So by having that high level principle, that resilience rating at that relatively crude level, you can then flag actually you need to go to speak to someone else, or you need to invoke another process. And that comes over one of those big challenges of what level of detail do you hold, depending on what you need to do. You don't want to hold too much information, but you only need to use it for the right person. We can also take in data from third-party sources, so we can proactively ping off to data sources, so like Data in Demand or Avini, and go, okay, yeah, has anything changed? And come in and say, yeah, marital status has changed. Okay, that may trigger for us to do something, depending on the product, what we're doing. Equally, if we haven't heard anything, we may proactively go out. So, and typically we're talking annually here in financial services, to annually check, has anything changed in your circumstances, and receive that back and just update that the rating. As part of that, then we build a very rich view of what that person has, their status and their understanding, and that gives us a complete audit trail of interactions, and hence from that we can then provide data for consumer duty requirements. And that may be looking at things like protected characteristics, and we can compare that across the firm. We can also compare that against national statistics, for example. So we could look at and say, well, how many people do you have of this religion or this or gender, and see is there a bias in what you're doing? Is there a bias between different distribution channels, between different offices, between different sections? And understanding that and comparing that against national statistics or against just other firms, benchmarking, you're going to go, hold on a minute, why is this office here only selling to white people? You know, there's no one of any other denomination or origination there. Is a bias being invoked? And only by collecting that data could you use that. So protected characteristics, and again on vulnerability, you can look at that and the spread across that. You can look at it at a high level, so just looking at the resilience rating, or you can look at it on an individual rating down at individual health items. And health, we break down into mental health and physical health. So from a so that's a very quick overview of the tool. From a compliance point of view, on the right-hand side there, so we have an objective resilience rating, which enables consistent reporting. We're storing it in a way which is GDPR compatible. We're giving consistent, controlled application of policy, and across the whole company. And if you speak to some compliance people, they go, well, we have this policy, but how is that inferred by people? How can we ensure that is being undertaken by sales forces in different areas? We can actively monitor, linking into other data sources, and by sending questionnaires out to people. It gives us a full audit trail, so we understand that and we can demonstrate that, so we can see what we've done, how we've interacted, and what we've done from that people. And protected characteristics are also captured, which is now a requirement under duty, which gives us rich data and reports for duty. On the left-hand side there, from the sales guy's point of view, and I use the word sales from we all know that in the commercial world, we're trying to sell products, particularly we're trying to keep customers. We don't want to go elsewhere. How do we collect that data? So by allowing consumer to be data to be collected by just an emailed consumer, that we're not holding up the sales process. We can collect that information in a way from different data sources, so we can assimilate that. If we need, if we have people who are already in a vulnerable situation, then our nurses can step in, although we do only expect that to be used in once in a blue moon from that point of view. And then we can share that data between across the firm and between different systems. So we build API into different CRM systems, so we can build that in. And when we link into a CRM system, we typically CRM would pass us the name and address and contact details, and we'll pass back just a high-level resilience rating. So that can sit in the CRM system, which for most people will show that their resilience is not an issue. Life can continue as it always has done. But then from then it flags, effectively it's flagging up saying, okay, this person has this particular issue. I need to look in the Mars tool. I can see what that issue is. I can then go and do something about it. So that gives us a complete way then to understand on our customers. The flip side, so part of this, I always look at the carrot and stick approach. So regulation, if you like, consumer duty is the stick. And we need to look at what is the benefits of this. Well, if we treat our customers better, we should improve trust with those customers, so we can so they'll work with us better. The greater understanding we have of the consumer, their characteristics, should lead us to have a more empathetic service to them. If we can share that from the salesperson, intermediary to the manufacturer in a distributed way, then rather than at the moment, typically sales guys would say, well, I know that person has is dyslexic. Hence I speak to them and I explain everything to them. But then the manufacturer would typically send out a long written document which maybe the person couldn't understand. So by sharing that information across the value chain, across the distribution chain, then other people, then the manufacturer can go, okay, I understand that person's issues. I need to amend how I can deal with them as well. Now that's not going to happen overnight, but you can see then by doing that, it'll vastly improve the situation. We can engage with customers then on health and lifestyle issues. So part of the whole financial services, generally financial services, you're helping people in a particular circumstance. A lot of those may be instigated by, getting married, having kids, the sort of different lifestyle events, having a mortgage, all those sort of things. So inheritance tax and so forth. So most of these things are being reactive to a lifestyle change. The more you understand about the customer, the more you can tailor what products and services are going to be suitable to them, which hopefully moves us away from being what we are at the most industries, to being product focused, to be more customer focused. If we can also share data between intermediary and manufacturer, that should lead to an improved service and being able to accommodate the vulnerability better rather than excluding them. So at the moment, there's a big fear financial exclusion, because people are saying, that person's, there's sort of, there's a, they may have dementia, for example. Oh, actually, do I really want to go there? Well, yes, absolutely. We can service everyone, no matter what their situation. We just need to have processes in place to be able to do that. So we can do mental capacity tests, for example. My nurses can help with those situations. So we shouldn't be excluding people just because they have a vulnerability. And if we can do that and we can take care of those, then all the people surrounding that individual will have much more trust and faith in us as an organization. And also, one of the things we have, particularly in insurance, is complementary services. So that may be bereavement counselling, for example, is quite a common one. So if we understand that person's circumstances better, then we can advertise, we can communicate to them that those services are available. At the moment, what tends to happen is the product manufacturer will say, well, we have bereavement as part of your insurance policy, but the advisor then won't necessarily won't have that all to hand, and certainly won't necessarily know when the bereavement with the consumer. So if we can link that up and provide that information across, we should be using a lot more of these services. And hence, if we're using a lot of these more services, then we're going to serve our customers better. So that's kind of the end of what I wanted to say. A couple of quotes there from Robert Sinclair and Johnny Timpson, if you know them, basically saying, and they're saying basically the same thing, which is, to really understand customers, we're going to need some really good data to do that. We need to get a bit more objective about it, and if we're going to do objective, then we need systems to do that. So you can read those at leisure. And so finally then, and I think I'm on time. So we built a resilience rating, which is similar to a credit score, and it should make managing for consumer duty then far more easy, because we're managing to understand this information. It's a whole process is secure, it's compliant, and it makes it far more cost effective. So we measure resilience, and then we can manage it from consumer duty point of view. By all means, look at the website, which isn't on there, which is www.morganash.com/Mars. We have a LinkedIn group called Consumer Duty Managing Vulnerability and Resilience. Please join that. And if you'd like to look at the tool, then we're happy to give free trial for a month to do that. I think that's the end. I'll hand back to Helen.
Thank you, Andrew. That's fabulous. Okay, so there's a few questions as well, Andrew, in the chat. I don't know if you want to pick those up as we go along, or we'll pick them up at the end. So I'm going to pass over to Mark from iHub, who I can't see, but I'm sure he's here.
I am, yes. Hello, just give me a second. There we go. I'll just go to screen share and then I can walk you through the presentation.
Thanks, Mark.
There we go. Everyone should be able to see that now. So I'm Mark McElvany. I'm Client Services Director for iHub. Within the business, I'm responsible for our end-to-end customer and client journey, and also our client onboarding. So any of our new products and services which come into the tool will come through myself and my team, as well as any new clients who join the network. Background to myself, so worked in credit and collections for over 15 years. So that's covering different elements of banking, secured and unsecured collections at a product, process and policy level, before moving to Step Change Debt Charity, where I worked within various business development, relationship management roles, ultimately with the responsibility of looking at customer affordability, assessing customers for financial difficulties, making referrals into the charity, and ultimately how to get that right level of engagement with the customer. So I'm going to talk a little bit around iHub, what we do, why we do it, and a little bit about our process. If anyone's interested after the session, please get in touch. We can set up a demo and show you kind of more of the end-to-end of the IE Hub product. So really wanted us to start to look at kind of what is the problem that IE Hub is out there to address. So looking at it from a client perspective, so the organizations that we deal with, obviously there's a big mountain problem in terms of financial vulnerability. World we live in today, energy crisis, cost of living crisis, there are more people falling into debt than have done in previous years. We've all been waiting, expecting for some kind of tsunami of debts on the back of COVID. That hasn't really happened. So thanks in part by different FCA-led regulation, firms being able to support customers and different levels of government support. But we are now in a position where that cost of living piece is starting to bite. And firms are then looking to engage with their customers to understand their affordability. But that engagement is essentially a challenge. Customers don't always want to have an open conversation about their debt, what's gone on in their lives, how are they trying to manage it. And there's a real heavy reliance on colleagues within the different collections departments needing to have specific skill sets to be able to understand, collect, manage that I&E data. And typically that's taken around 45 minutes per typically a collections call, or more so pre-arrears call, as we move into consumer duty, where we're starting to talk to firms about how do they assess customers earlier in the process, make sure they're still operating as they'd expect, and the products that they've offered are still fit for purpose. Conversations obviously then complex, and particularly in a collections environment, customers are going through an income and expenditure on the fly, so they're not sat waiting, ready, prepared for a collections call where they're expected to answer lots of information. So that ultimately, it's putting a lot of stress, a lot of pressure. It's the mastermind chair scenario, as I like to think about it, where that customer's on the spot answering lots of questions about their income and their expenditure. And ultimately, customer loses track. They've given lots of numbers down the phone, and they don't really know what their final outcome is. Then compounding that situation, that happens again and again and again across their different debt portfolios. So typically, scenario on the previous slide would be one customer to one creditor, but we see that happening between 5 and 7 times across a customer's debt portfolio. So covering everything from FCA regulated businesses through to utilities, telcos, and then a local government, and actually also within debt advice as well. So where that is becoming a point of support, it is a repetition of that debt advice scenario. So again, that single customer who's feeling stressed, anxious about doing an I&E goes round the cycle again 5, 6, 7 times, lots of pressure, lots of anxiety, lots of their time spent repeating an I&E. But because they're giving the data out on the fly, it becomes inconsistent. So there are lots of different outcomes sat with different creditors, and ultimately the objective that the creditor has, and in the main a lot of customers want to do, is pay down their debt, maintain the products and services that they've signed up for. That becomes increasingly more difficult. So that's where IE Hub are now focusing to try and readdress that balance. And what we're looking at is taking an I&E, which is a very time-consuming, repetitive process, and putting that back in the customer's hands. So we have a 2-way income and expenditure process, which allows the customer to create one central income and expenditure and share it with any organisation that they want to. That sharing typically becomes part of with organisations who are part of the IE Hub network. So we have data sharing agreements sat in place. Customer will go through the IE Hub customer journey, usually at the request of one creditor, starting that conversation. Customer does their I&E with us, they store it within IE Hub, and they can push it to any of our network members. If the customer wants to share their I&E outside of their network, they're able to do so. We've got various options where they can download and email or even print and post their I&E. And from an IE Hub perspective, we really want to focus on that engagement, that consistency of I&E. And we do support our users to get their I&E to any organisation they want to. And we do that through our free post facility. So particularly where we recognise customers who don't have access to a printer, may not even be able to afford a stamp, IE Hub at the request of that customer will take their consent and we will send their I&E to their creditor. That's our main customer journey, usually done by, say, the instruction of a creditor for the customer to log into our portal, create an I&E and share it. But as we kind of move through the different spectrums of vulnerability, we'll have customers at different levels of understanding and capability from of their own financial circumstances. And we look at kind of a different range in how we want to set up, manage and monitor those I&Es. So we can have customers who want you to do an I&E for them, and that can be managed within our creditor portal. So as part of our network, you can create an I&E on your screen for that customer and push it back into the IE Hub network for the customer to then share on further. You can do it with a customer, so you can do part over the phone, customer can do part themselves and ultimately finish that off and share it. Or you will have customers who just don't want to have a conversation. It is a difficult, challenging subject to be discussed. And we'll have situations where the customer just wants to log in at their own time, their own convenience, navigate their I&E and share it with their creditors. Ultimately, what we then want to do is build that better customer experience. So focused a lot on debt, as I say, more so as we speak around consumer duty. We want to check in on those customers in pre-arrears scenario. We are going to see more I&Es being needed higher up the chain. From an engagement perspective, IE Hub, we see an 89% engagement rate across our networks. That's customers starting, finishing and sharing their I&E. Where creditors are spending lots of time over the phone, they can really focus on the customer who isn't able to do the I&E themselves, get the customer to fill that in through IE Hub and share it. But our partners are seeing a reduction in their AHT up to 64%. We always validate our process. So everything that we do, every change that we make to IE Hub, is it working? Are we doing the right things for our customers? And we will continually survey, monitor, assess what's going on within IE Hub. 83% of our customers tell us kind of managing their I&E, having that control, that greater understanding. 83% of those customers said we reduced their financial anxiety. And ultimately, again, sort of the why is everybody going through an I&E? Predominantly, our partners work in a collections environment, and that's resulting in a 92% kept rate on repayment plans. So we're monitoring both the customer satisfaction and also the impact on the creditor operation. Is that able to help customers understand and manage their finances to the point at which they make those payments? Just bring it back to from a consumer duty perspective. So what IE Hub has within our platform is a range of workflow tools, and those workflows are designed to keep the customer engaged and ultimately check in on that customer. So you've got the initial instigation of the IE Hub journey, which will give you a lot of income and expenditure information, and ultimately come up with an affordability assessment. So we can get a as of today, what's the impact on your customer? But then along that journey, the IE Hub pathways and workflows kick in. And ultimately that gets us into a position of regular checks, regular updates and refresh of the I&E. So the customer will share an updated position of their affordability at least once every 6 months with you. Because of our network, and our network is very broad, so we work not just with financial services organisations, we work increasingly more so with utility providers. And where the energy cap is at the moment and the kind of the review of that, that's changing customer finances on a quarterly basis. And that's creating another prompt for that customer to go in where their energy bill this time last year might have been £100. It's gone to £200 middle of this year, and then maybe expecting the £300 energy bill come October. that's another prompt for that customer to go into IE Hub. They own, they manage, control their situation, they update their INE, and they will share it with everybody in the network. So there's a continual opportunity to know your customer and be able to assess how the world around them is changing and what that means for them in terms of the financial products or services they have with yourselves. Within the IE Hub journey, we then have full audit services. So we can see every INE that has been shared with each organisation. And internally, you can monitor that just from a day-to-day quality management perspective, but also over a longer term view. So checking back decisions that were made on a customer maybe 6 or 12 months ago, what financial information did you have on that customer? That would be evidenced in the form of their INE. With the INE, as well as just the document which the customer shares and discloses, we have evidence capturing. So a customer can include copies of pay slips, bank statements. If they use a smartphone to go through our journey, and they can attach photographs, any particular documentary evidence they have on their desk, take a photo of that, that can be attached to their INE. So again, we're evidencing the process, we've got consistency of the INE, and we've got longevity in what's going on. We do have open banking within the IE Hub customer journey. That is, again, another point of evidence, another point of consistency that we have within the INE. We get about 30% user take up around open banking, and that is growing. As an industry, there's probably still a little bit of nervousness, skepticism around what is open banking, why is it used. But if the customer does make that choice and they complete their INE directly from their bank account, again, we'll give another form of evidence against that INE. We'll validate specifically elements of their income and outgoings that have been taken directly from source. So you've got the integration with VRS. So we are a partner, we signpost to each other's organisations, and probably in the next month we'll have a continual stream where we'll be able to check that customer against VRS to see if they've pre-registered. As IE Hub, we can deliver data in a range of different forms. So we can integrate with existing CRM systems and other services, so there's potential integration with Morgan Ash and others. We integrate with things like CNR Software's Debt Manager platform, and where we have that level of integration, that will allow you to drive more strategies. So where you've got a clean view of a customer's affordability, what does that mean? Do we move them into maybe a vulnerable process management if they're particularly financially vulnerable? Do we put them into more of a monitoring stage? Do we need to make a referral into debt advice? As IE Hub, part of our network and members of our network are free and charitable debt advice providers. Any debt advice providers on the call can join the IE Hub network free of charge. That's part of our commitment to be able to support more customers, but also to assist that side of the industry. And as of Monday this week, any customer who has gone through an income and expenditure within IE Hub, we will also conduct a welfare benefit check for the customer. We'll flag where there are any potential benefit increases available to them and support them to validate and go through the application process. As well as the benefit check, we then also have a social tariff check. So looking at that customer's region, the water company which supplies them, we will check the customer's financial details against the criteria of that water company. And if the customer qualifies, again, we'll flag to them the potential discount or support that they might have in relation to their water arrears or their general water bill. And typically for organisations, the water companies who are part of our network, all that customer then needs to do is share the INE, and the customer would qualify for that discount. For some water suppliers around the country, that can be as much as an 80% reduction. So particularly when we get into debt, or where we're trying to avoid debt, we can do some elements of income maximisation through the process as well. Appreciate that was just a bit of a whistle stop tour of IE Hub end to end. Does anybody have any questions?
I think we've got a few which Simon will sweep up. I think that, I mean, Mark, I think that just demonstrates really that how important it is, and how organisations are trying to balance the needs of the customer, the consumer, against the needs of a business as well, and trying to reach the right, use the word again, but the right outcome comes for everybody. Simon, do you just want to quickly whiz through some of these questions, and we'll sweep up anything else at the end? You're on mute, Simon.
Mark, do you see creditors, example banks and utilities, actively using the IE hub to manage customers with problem debt?
Yeah, I mean, that's our typical partnership model is within collections. So one thing that we have sort of really pushed on, and Money and Pension Service have obviously been instrumental, is the introduction of the standard financial statement. So where it kind of initially started within financial services, we're seeing particularly utility companies adopting that as their measure of affordability, and again into local authorities and their collections processes, where that might have been a different method, I suppose is a fair way to put it.
Okay, great, thank you. And so Sarah, a quick one, says it's great that you all integrate with each other, and I'll echo that. And Oliver's asked, Mark, where do you see the need for improvement in the open banking process? He says it appears to be underused by consumers, and there's a lot of potential being left on the table in Oliver's opinion.
I think from my perspective, open bank, it's very much it's a lack of education, probably a lack of marketing. So open banking as a name, as terminology, it probably doesn't tell you exactly what it is, creates a lot of nervousness, and particularly the main customers that we deal with, they're already nervous, frightened about sharing their position. It is going to take a lot of education, people on this call, others, it's in talking to the customer about what are the benefits, what are the values. As IE Hub, we have two journeys. It doesn't have to be an open banking journey. Customers that want to do it, great. Those that don't, there's a manual handheld journey that they can go through. I think it's going to take a lot of time and sort of nudges along the way to let people know what open banking is, what's the benefit for them, and that really comes down to that value proposition. If I'm going to go and get a new mortgage, I'm probably quite happy to let my bank have access to that bank account because I'll get the mortgage at the end of it. The value proposition isn't really there in collections, and probably less so in pre-arrears, because that's probably the point where it's just a creditor maybe coming across as being nosy rather than having a specific purpose.
There's a huge amount of awareness, I think, for consumers in all of this, that I think we all have a part to play in, and I think it probably answers I think so he just put a question on as well. I mean, we're trying to and we are starting to work to ensure that the consumers that we do identify as in vulnerable circumstances are made aware and sort of led to where they can get support around things like broadband, social tariffs, water tariffs, all of that, rather than them having to go to different places to get the support they need. And I think going back to the collaborative integrating together, that's why it's really important, because we can point people in the right direction, so they're not sort of scrabbling around on the internet or picking things up or trying to go in the right direction all the time. I'm going to move on, and we'll come back to any other questions, and I'm sure the speakers will pick some of these things up in the chat as well, but I'm just conscious of time. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of training aspect of things, and the customer journey, and some of the tools that are out there to help with that. And I'll pass on to Chris and Carolyn, and we'll talk about inclusive service design. I think we have a big ask of people dealing with vulnerable customers in lots of different ways. I mean, it's stressful. We've got and we need to equip them to do the job. And I'm always mindful of years ago when I was in my 20s managing an Experian, managing the consumer-facing team, and I've got hundreds of staff, and you're suddenly confronted with dealing with anything from fertility, drug addiction, marriage breakdowns, bereavement, the lot, and very ill equipped to do so. And I think, you know, we are asking staff to deal with all those aspects, and you can't, with the best will in the world, expect them to be experts on them. So they have to find ways of managing them. So I'm going to pass over to Chris and then to Carolyn, who will start to talk about sort of some of the areas that we are putting in place to try and support those customer journeys. Chris.
Thank you very much, Helen. Let me see if I can push the right button. Okay, you're looking at a slide? Great, cool. Thank you very much. Yeah, my name's Chris Jones. I'm the founder of a company called VCX, the Vulnerable Customer Experience. We're a training company. We're currently just going through a little bit of a rebrand exercise. The mortarboard is new. We are an education outfit. That's what we're really here to do, to provide insight and education into corporates, particularly around this conversation with vulnerable people. The focus I want to pick up on today is that amongst all of this consumer duty, and we'll look into it in just a minute and just look at some of the actual wording around the support outcome, people are at the middle of it, and people, our customers are people, and the consumer duty and the FCA is focused on very, very rightly on consumers. But in a lot of our businesses that are not purely digital, it's the frontline staff that are the interface between what we're doing as a business and what the actual consumer is receiving. So there's a few things that I want to look at. One, is the consumer duty going to have an impact on service agents and advisors? Are those customer service agents and advisors already stretched emotionally by the plight of customers suffering from pandemics and wars and price rises and anything else that you'll hear if you put the news on? And is there a danger of going overboard with evidence-based measuring tools that have a result that there's more KPIs put in place that heap even more pressure on our frontline staff? So that's really the direction I want to take this in. If your organization has a call center, whether that's still in a call center, they may well be distributed now, which is more difficult to manage. How are we going to manage these people, protect these people, and look after these people through, certainly in the short term? We have a challenging year ahead of us, because if we don't look after them, we can't really look after our customers, because they will just be left to digital tools, web chats, bits of software. And when we talk about vulnerability, it is the human interaction which often really makes the difference. So let's just dive into the consumer duty. Section 9 is the consumer support outcome, and a set of rules that are listed out in 9.3. And they talk about designing and delivering support that meets the needs of customers, including those with characteristics of vulnerability, ensuring that customers can use products as reasonably anticipated, ensure they include appropriate friction in customer journeys to mitigate the risk of harm and give customers sufficient opportunity to understand and assess their options, including any risks. Ensure customers do not face unreasonable barriers, including unreasonable costs during the lifestyle of a product or service. To monitor the quality of the support that they are offering, looking for evidence that may indicate where they fall short of that outcome and act promptly to address these. And to ensure that they do not disadvantage particular groups of customers, including those with characteristics of vulnerability. Well, I'm guessing that Carolyn might talk about a few of those, particularly around service design. And if you look at the sludge and friction in there as well on the customer journey, that's certainly something that I would imagine that she would focus on. What we've talked about a lot today is just monitoring the quality of support that we're offering. We've looked a lot at the evidence and how you might collect the evidence. The quality of support you know, that's a little bit more subjective, I think, and perhaps we'll dig into that a little bit. So, having read section 9 a number of times, the bit I keep coming back to, because I think it's the clearest direction from the FCA that actually says, all right, here are some examples of some questions that you can expect to be asked when we ask you about consumer duty. So, all right, that gives us something to actually have a look at. And those questions are, I just think we just run through them because it's good to keep them in our mind. Has the firm satisfied itself that its customer support is effective in meeting customer needs, regardless of the channels used? And do you test outcomes across different channels? What assessment has a firm made about whether its customer support is meeting the needs of customers with characteristics of vulnerability? What data, MI, customer feedback is being used? It's some great presentations already that would do exactly the Morgan Ash tool, the stuff that Aveni do, a great way of amassing data around understanding the nature of our customer base. How has a firm satisfied itself that it's at least as easy to switch or leave its products as it is to buy them in the first place? Now that's a big one that's come up in consumer duty. It says, you know, have you put as much resource into supporting customers as you have to selling to customers? And I think that's a huge question. And you know, we're running businesses here. Can we put our hand on our heart and say, yeah, of course we are. I don't even know how you would do that, because if you buy an insurance product that you buy it online, there's no, you know, I don't need any interaction with that. If I want to claim on that product, I need a lot of support. So you almost need more focus on support than on sales. Again, about data and MI feedback the firm is using to monitor the impact on customer support is having on the outcomes. Again, we've touched on that. So the thread that comes through all of this is the data element. It's the MI. It's how we're capturing it, how are we measuring it, how can you report it back to us as a regulator and use that to drive decisions within your business. And I think that's good. You know, that is good. It makes it easier for the FCA to be able to do its job. But where I think it comes at a risk is we focus on the MI, because what is MI and what's it for? Now, we know we need a lot of it, and we know we need clever people that do analytics to actually make some sense of it. But if we're collecting information because it's easy to collect, or because we think that it's part of the process, it's part of the solution, and we focus too much on the data without thinking about, well, what's the actual impact of what that data does, what that data, it might tell us something about the consumer. What does it tell us about our business? So complaints data, call handling times, usage channels, customer feedback scores, these are all very kind of good bits of MI. When we bring that down to a customer service advisor level, it becomes very focused. Now, generally, call centers are target-driven operations are often outsourced to third parties, and people want to get value for money. So normally top of the list is complaints resolved or cases resolved, queries resolved. What's your average call handling time? What's the time in wrap? All sorts of call center metrics that Joseph would be able to tell you a lot more than me. But agent utilization rate, you know, the amount of minutes they spend in the loo, you know, these are all bits of data that we can collect, which might lead to efficiency of our operation to support customers. Monitoring the amount of time we spend in the loo probably isn't the best metric for somebody who's actually trying to do that job, to know that they're not trusted to be able to do their job in a certain way. Again, if we collect vulnerability information, and if we go back to the AI presentation we saw from Aveni earlier, if it's used in the right way and the way that they described it as a feedback loop and an opportunity to highlight training needs and to build up the training resource of the human beings in the organization, then it's great. But I think we've all seen many situations where you get a metric, it's got to be managed, it's got to be hit, and it's like, we forget why we're doing it. We just need to get to the number, or we need to get it green. Everything's green, everything's fine here. It's like, well, you know, we got an operation of 300 people. 300 people are never fine. What's the personal problem that we're having in being able to actually meet this metric? So I think, these are questions that we really have to focus on. And I think one of the things that we can think about is when we start to collect data, can we start with the people? Can we start with the people on the front line? Can we ask them, have they had sufficient training? Rather than saying, okay, you only completed 80% of your training so far. Your average score on the 80% that you did create was 67%. Your neighbors were 73%. Why is that? And I've seen these conversations all the time. Rather than saying, have you had sufficient training? And you ask that question to one set of call center agents, and they'll say, don't give me any more training. We're overwhelmed with training. We can't handle more training. We don't have enough time to do our job. Other call center agents were saying, no, I feel inadequate to be able to support customers, which I'm encouraging to disclose painful vulnerabilities in complex situations. I think then we have to kind of split that up into, well, yeah, the quantitative data is good because it allows us to be able to track metrics over time. But are we collecting enough data on the well-being of our staff? Do they understand the purpose of what they're actually doing? Do they attach some value in the support that they're offering? Or are we just ticking a box and moving on? So it's that people focus that when we're looking at putting our plans in place for the consumer duty, how have we got our people at the center of it? The approach that we take to that, we are an e-learning provider, a training provider. I think language is the key. One of the things that the cost of living crisis has really brought to a head for us is the fact that we've started to train everybody in an organization with a key understanding of what we're talking about, as opposed to just the welfare teams or just the customer support teams. Because, and it always comes up, I'm not a vulnerable person. It's like, well, what is vulnerability? Let's get that on the table that, we're a human being, we're frail, we're fragile, we react badly, situations happen all around us. Let's not be afraid about the label vulnerability. And there's a whole bunch of other metrics that are and terms which are used within consumer duty, like detriment and harm and all the rest of it. Unless the whole organization knows what we're talking about, very difficult to have a really meaningful conversation. Behaviors and creating habits, I think this to us is really important. It's why you do your job. It's why, as a customer service agent, I'm going to come to work and help people rather than for the same money drive a van and deliver parcels for Amazon. I could listen to Radio 2 all day and be quite chilled about it, or I can listen to 8 hours of people pouring their heart out. And that's like, why would I do that? If all that does is heaps emotional stress on me, I'll take the Amazon job. So I think, when we look at understanding people's motivation and the organizational purpose, then these are key factors which can actually elevate confidence and efficiency and willingness for staff to actually go the extra mile, which is what we're looking to do in the consumer duty. Interestingly, there's the module we produced on purpose and culture we did with a chap called Alex Edmonds, professor of economics at London Business School. And there's an evidence case in there that says, treat your staff well, they will treat your customers well, and your business will outperform its peers. It's, it's not just cost written in here. And then there's specific vulnerability training. And there's lots of organizations and charities and training departments that do this very well, that provide insight into specific characteristics of vulnerability. We've got one, we're working with older people. We also have one managing conversations of self-harm and suicide. These are fundamental things that, depending on your customer base, you're going to provide some focus on. The problem is with the specific vulnerability training is if over a period of time, you can have so much of it that it's inaccessible, and it's very, very difficult to remember what has been trained and what hasn't. Our little piece of tooling that goes with that, we brought 1,100 vulnerabilities into one place, into a directory. You can access this as a web-based tool. There's a couple of mandatory e-learning modules that you can complete within 2 hours. And then you can use this as a database of vulnerability, which is mapped onto 500 charities, 600 charities now, that actually support those vulnerabilities. So if you need a place to go find some signposting information, there's an example there of Fragile X syndrome, for example. It's a genetic condition that's the most common cause of learning disabilities. You may not know that, but there's a Fragile X Society. You may not know that either, but if somebody shares that with you, or if the FCA walk into your call center and sit down next to one of your agents, rather than actually look at the MI, they sit down next to a person and say, if I was on the phone, or if I shared with you that I have Fragile X syndrome, what would you do? Or any other vulnerability, because the list is probably endless. I mean, we've got 1,100 at the moment, and it's continually expanding. But for somebody to be able to say, well, I can tell you that it's a genetic condition. Around 1 in 3 people with Fragile X are also diagnosed with autism, and there's a society here. That's evidence-based, the ability to be able to show how you're actually going to do, as well as be able to collect the data. Also built in with the toolkit are the questioning protocols, so Texas, IDEA, carers, and we get some sort of standardization of questioning in here, which is built into the e-learning as well. This is all information on our website. It's a kind of a new website, which is just sort of poking its head above the water, but it's live. It's vulnerablecustomers.co.uk. You can have a look at it there. So I really just want to sort of come back to those questions that we looked at earlier. Will the duty have an impact on agents and service advisors? Yeah, I think it will. I think it will have a huge impact. They have to get closer to complex situations the customers face. Are they stretched emotionally? Yeah, absolutely. And that comment I made about Amazon wasn't a flippant comment. It's a conversation I've had with somebody recently that says we can't keep our staff. They're off to deliver packages because for the same money, they don't have to handle the stress. And is there a danger? There's always a danger with how you employ metrics, and that level of training through the management layers, that we have a common language, that we're trying to support consumers for the right reasons, and our hearts behind that is what needs to translate all the way down through the organization. It can't end up with a new set of metrics for the poor people on the phone to say, oh no, I've only ticked, I spoke to 100 customers this week and I've only ticked 30 vulnerability boxes. The average is 50. I mean, I'm in trouble, because it just can't work like that. We have to make this cultural shift, and it starts with language. It builds into purpose. And then the application to the frontline staff is, here's some tools that will help you to do it, to give you some confidence to actually have those conversations in a way which is helpful. And we have the capacity to actually deliver or signpost some information to somebody that could be life-changing and life-saving in a situation where you have somebody who is lost hope and is in a potentially self-harm suicide situation. We need instant access to tools that can help that. So a minute over, I think, there, Helen, but thank you very much indeed. That's my pitch for all those people sat in a customer service centre.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Lovely. Right, I shall pass quickly over to Carolyn. We are running over a little bit between us. I think we'll pick up any questions at the end, but I'll pass over to Carolyn, because if anybody needs to jump off after her presentation, but I think Carolyn's enthusiasm and passion for a subject is always worth a good listen to. So Carolyn.
Great, thanks, Helen. So hopefully you can see my slides and hear me fine. Great. Thanks. Okay, so hi everybody. Hopefully, I think many of you know me already, but for those that don't, my name's Carolyn Delahunty, and I'd just like to take a moment to thank the VRS first of all for inviting me today and Helen and my fellow speakers and all you attendees for the continued efforts that you put into improving the lives of vulnerable customers. I've spent 23 years in the utilities industry and telcos, 11 of those in customer experience and 10 in procurement, so I have a nice customer and commercial balance. For the last 4 years, I've been working independently, helping regulated organisations listen to the needs of their vulnerable customers and redesign their experiences to deliver improvements that they value, notice, and importantly, change how they feel about your organisation, which drives their behaviours and actions. It's called inclusive service design, but I also bring along a load of extra disciplines which help you embed it as a way of life, not just a single project. I do with, not to, so that I want to leave a lasting knowledge to leave you self-sufficient. There's only one of me, there's lots of you, and together we can make a big difference. But I do what I do because I've got lived experience of being financially vulnerable. I want to stop others going through what I went through. 20 years ago, my bank said to me, we can't extend your overdraft by £100, but we can loan you £1,000. It's called responsible lending. And that's still a phrase that's used today. I took that loan and I spent the next 6 years in debt. So my goal this year is to improve the lives of 750,000 vulnerable people through the organisations they engage with. So I'd just like to take a moment, first of all, around consumer duty. You've heard lots around consumer duty, and I've no doubt for the last 12 months or so, you've been to lots of webinars about consumer duty. But my gosh, what a web it is. It's 121 pages of guidance, including principle, rule, outcomes. It's underpinned by the reasonableness test. The handbook principles still apply, but some do and some don't. The guidance on fair treatment of vulnerable customers, legal requirements around the Equality Act and consumer rights, complementary discussions along with the diversity and inclusion along the financial sector. Many of you haven't got your cameras on, so I won't ask for nods, but please go to that reaction button at the bottom and give me a thumbs up if you feel in the web that could potentially trap you. So how critical are vulnerable customers in consumer duty? Well, they mention vulnerable 25 times, and 19 of those times are in the key sections from 4 to 9. They mention vulnerability 83 times, and 70 of those mentions reference in sections 4 to 9 as well. So I think it's pretty central, even though consumer duty applies to your entire customer base. So I want to help you. I've got one slide today, and it's going to be a checklist, something that's really going to help you go away from this call and go to your plans, go to your change program and say, are we in the right space? But before I do, I want to connect you with some real customer stories that I've seen recently. So firstly, Peter, he's a single dad. His benefits were overpaid and they were clawed back. He has little consistency for his kids because his income is fluctuating. He's pulled from pillar to post, whether it's the job centre or learning at college so that he can get another job. His payment arrangements he can't afford, and is borrowing from a family member to put carpets on his newly allocated home. Sally, she's got a betting addiction, a gambling addiction. She started out with just gambling with coins, and then it switched to notes, and then it became online as it's quicker. Every month, within 40 minutes of her wages being paid, they're transferred to her online gambling account, and they're gone every month. Thankfully, she's now recovered. And then Sue, her job is supporting supporting customers on the front line through vulnerable circumstances. So every day she's out there helping the most vulnerable people improve their lives, whether it's get through to the benefits teams or get through to the utility teams that they need to speak to resolve their problems. But she has her own mental health challenges and her own complex life to navigate. And last but not least, there's Lucy and Ahmed. These are your frontline advisors there, and we've touched on this in the last presentation. All day, every day, they're taking tough calls at the moment. They're running out of options, and they have their own issues to deal with as well. These are real human beings. They're not a principle, they're not a rule, and they're not an outcome. So when we move forward to navigating the web, what can you do now to make a difference for your vulnerable customers? I'm not a big fan of checklists, but given where we are, about a month out from the deadline to have your implementation plan ready for the FCA to inspect, and the proximity of the implementation, I think a checklist would be really helpful for you. So that's what I've done today. So first off, this is a summary of inclusive service design in a nutshell. And I just want to ask you leave you with some questions that you can then take away to look at your plans and improvements to say, are we doing this? And if you can hold your head high and say, yes, you've done it in earnest and with quality and focus around quantification as well, you'll be in a good place. So first of all, have you listened to your customers? So you can't know what they need without speaking to them. You might have asked your internal colleagues who have vulnerabilities what they need. They're not your customers. Maybe they are, sometimes in water companies they are, but not in financial services generally. So make sure you're asking your vulnerable customers what they need. And it doesn't need to be a complex or 6 to 9 month research program. Of course, lots of organizations have that, that's great. But you just need to have listened to some, get 10 or 12 of them in a room together, and they enjoy nothing better than telling organizations what they're doing wrong. Do you understand their needs, not only their circumstances? So it's very tempting to have your vulnerability flags. They've got this, they've got that, they've got the other. But what does that mean? By focusing on their needs, you begin to get some economies of scale when you develop your solutions. Understanding their pain points. What are you doing to make life harder for them? How are you adding friction that's not welcome for them? So we touched on positive friction before, but often organizations are creating friction that they don't realize they're creating. Do your advisors agree with what these pain points are? So your customers will tell you, but your advisors will feel the same pain all day, every day. As Chris said before, they have the I often say they have the hardest job in an organization. They have to balance what an organization offers with what a customer actually needs. And believe me, they'll know your pain points or your customers' pain points. And have you evidenced these challenges with data? If you don't put data on it, it's all perception based and you've got shonky foundations on which to build on. If you evidence it with data, you've got a much solid foundation. Doesn't need to be perfect, just good enough to prove that it's a big pain point and there's an opportunity to fix it. Co-creating solutions. Did your vulnerable customers contribute to the ideas to solve the problem? Did you invite them in to the workshop and ask them how do organizations build trust with you, or give you clear information, or help you access their information? Who does it well and what can we learn from them? By including them, they'll contribute their ideas, and not only the ideas, they'll tell you honestly whether or not your chosen solution is when tested is working for them and addresses their needs. And in the new experience for them, have they noticed and do they value the experience that you've delivered? And importantly, how does it change how they feel? By changing how they feel, you can begin to tap into changing behaviours, changing actions, and believe it or not, the outcomes that you want are often the outcomes that they want. So 20 years ago, when I first started in customer experience, my first action after learning all this sort of information, was to go away and check my change pipeline. I highly recommend you do the same, as well as your impending implementation plan. And I'll end it there with just 3 minutes to go. Hope that's okay, Helen.
That is perfect. Thank you very much. That is wonderful as always, Carolyn. Right, we are sort of coming to the end of our time. I just want to, before I hand over, and we'll go through questions, just to thank all the speakers today, and thank you all for listening. It's we're changing sort of the fundamentals of the way we operate while we're trying to look at vulnerability, and I think it can be very hard work, and you have to be quite committed, and I think all the people that have spoken today are trying to do that. And also quickly. Thank you, Heidi, for your brilliant administration skills as always. Simon, can I pass over to you to run through questions, and I'll scan to see if anybody wants to put their hands up while you're going through the chat.
Thanks. Yeah. So a number of questions. I think Andrew's proactively managed to reply to most of, if not all of the ones that were directed at him. We've got a couple of kind of fairly big ones, I think. So Carolyn said that open banking needs a rebrand. So something I hadn't considered. She said it's well intended and a useful tool for VCs, but the name does it no favours. So is open banking in danger of becoming the sort of genetically modified foods of the financial sector? Anyone?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in to answer that. Nobody wants silences when we're 1 minute from the end, do they? So, yeah. So, I mean, as I say, I think it's well intended, and it offers some good services, some good functionality. But when I was vulnerable, God, the prospect of just sharing my data with everybody, my financial, I chose who I was in debt, who I told I was struggling financially with. I don't want to click a button and tell everybody that it happens. Mm. And so, and you know, I'm not even that close to open banking. It's not my specialism at all. But if I'm feeling that as a customer now, how would people who are not even further away from financial services be feeling about it? It's just shrouded in too much mystery at the moment for me, and like I say, its name doesn't do it any favors.
No, I agree with you, Caroline. I think it's a fantastic tool. I think there's a lack of understanding. I think why it's probably not used is the same reason people don't, you know, it's the same thing with open banking as it is with vulnerability data. Once you've got hold of it, what you actually do with it, and you know, you need to make decisions around the information. But having said that, I think there's a huge opportunity for consumer empowerment there if they have control over their data and can release it when they want to release it. And I mean, I suppose what open banking does, a credit file, credit report data, which is used all over the place, and I don't think people realize how extensively credit data is used about them, because it's not just about making credit decisions, but it's a snapshot, whereas open banking sort of complements that in a way. And I think if used in the right way, I think there is a massive future for it myself. But I think, yes, I totally relate to what, do you really want everybody to know what you're spending your money on a daily basis?
Yeah, I think there's a value exchange. So, you know, what is the consumer gaining from doing it? The sort of the most people think about certainly financial services is our customers won't give us that information because they're scared of GDPR and its misuse, and that's kind of the traditional view. And absolutely, if we take data, we store it, we use it without telling the customer what we're doing with it, that's going to continue. So I think there has to be much more about, well, actually, if we engage with you, consumer, you give us information, this is what the benefit is to you, and that helps you, then this so-called value exchange, then we can see far more that data being used. But it is on a consent basis. So the consumer is the one who chooses who they share it with. So our view is that, you know, if the consumer can choose, say, okay, I want to share it with my bank, my financial advisor, my debt advisor, and no one else, then you can see that model really working. But rather than I'm giving it and I don't know who's using it. And so I think GDPR from that point of view helps in that essence. But I agree with the tenant that actually, you know, the name at the moment and the fear is holding it being used.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. We've had another question. Andrew, you might be best placed to answer this one, actually. It says, I know the guidance suggests we should look at payment break or holiday, but with short-term agreements, it's not always an option as it increases the overall debt and wouldn't be responsible. So usually needs to be cancelled. Would this be classed as a good outcome, or at the very least fair?
Pass. That's not my expertise. I guess it's understanding the circumstances, isn't it? There's nothing, you know, in the whole of consumer duty, we still expect organizations to be run commercially. If they loan money, they've perfectly got the right to get that money back. What they can't do is just go in glad hand without understanding the consumer's characteristics. So part of that is recording evidence of the situation. Have they been reasonable? You know, have they understand the person's circumstances when they took out the loan? Are they being reasonable? Are they giving payment holidays? But at the end of the day, they're absolutely still in their right to claw that money back. So they will need to do more and more evidence, but there's nothing stopping them being commercial in trying to get their money back at the end of it. So is that fair? Well, I think the answer is yes.
Okay, great, thank you. And then the final one for today, Mark Trevor said that we know from the FCA handbook that currently creditors have an obligation to signpost customers with financial problems to debt advisory and management services. Do we think Consumer Duty compels creditors to be more proactive in managing and helping customers struggling with debt rather than passing them on to debt advisors?
Yeah, and I think far more signposting, and I think also the word signpost is sort of typically used to say, we'll just give you a name and it's up to you. I think there's more, handovers, I think will come into, I'm going to help you get in touch with this organization because they can help you, and then I may check if you've done that. So more rather than just sort of fire and forget. So I think a lot more of that will come into play. And companies will need to show that they've done that, so that if helping that consumer be they're vulnerable or not to overcome their particular problem is part of the solution, then you need evidence to show, yeah, absolutely, I've done that. I've recommended they speak to this organization. I've given them the information. There may be circumstances where you proactively say, look, I'll get them to call you. So we know a lot of people may be hesitant to do those sort of things. So I think, rather than just relying on the person saying, oh, here's the website, off you go, I can see us being a bit more pushy and a bit more nudge from that point of view, to say, look, actually, it really helps, to speak to Gambling Anonymous. I tell you what, I'll get Gambling Anonymous to phone you. Are you happy with that? So just being a bit more pushy and those sort of things, I think will help. Exactly how we do that, obviously, will be down to individual circumstances. But yeah, I see a lot more referrals and things. And the charities out there, most of them are fantastic. So we can use them, and we should be engaging with them more. We may need to put in, I think we will need to put in data sharing, agreements with those people, because, to help those people to go through that. Equally, you could be saying to someone, look, I recommend you speak to these gambling people. If you get on that, if you help them sort out, then we will give you a holiday on your repayment. If you don't do that, then we're not going to. We're just going to ask for our money back. So a bit of carrot and stick from that point of view. Sometimes, certainly in the clinical world, you have to be a bit of tough love.
Thanks, really great answer, Andrew. Helen, I think we're well.
I think we are. I just noticed in the chat, Jason Wassell just answered somebody. I don't know if Jason's around, but I just think it's a good point, because we sort of vilify a little bit some of the solutions that sit there around short-term credit and buy now, pay later getting absolute stick in the press, and I think it's important to understand that it's not always detrimental, and that there's not a very big gap between regulated credit and people falling into unregulated credit, and I think we need to embrace all the options in the right way that are available to us. I don't know if Jason's around, whether he wants to comment on that at all. Jason, there he is. He just flicked onto screen and disappeared again. Hi,
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah. No, I'm just answering the question. Somebody was asking about payment holidays, and I think with short-term lending, the FCA's view has always been that payment holidays for short-term lending shouldn't involve additional interest. It should always be done as a payment freeze, as an interest freeze, so that it shouldn't cost more. It should, I think, as Carolyn said there, it should give people more time, and that's what they need without an additional cost. Now, some lenders may write that off, that's fine. But going to the point that you're making, Helen, and you've made earlier, is that there is a short distance between regulated and unregulated lending. We just need to be careful about this and watch for people that fall out because of vulnerabilities and fall out into kind of more difficult kind of environments, particularly illegal lending, and those kind of loan sharks that exist outside of regulated lending as well. So a couple of answers there to a couple of different points.
No, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so thanks everybody, and thanks for sticking with us. I hope it was useful. We do these webinars regularly. I think it was important to sort of focus on consumer duty. We've got big deadlines to meet. We do put them out on LinkedIn, and we'd probably relentlessly communicate them to you all anyway. I think where we'll be focusing next will be around more case studies, more practicalities about what we can do in terms of practically helping consumers, and I'll draw on the experience of the people that we deal with. So look forward to that. Thank you all again. Heidi will share the chat, I'm sure, and any questions that we haven't picked up we'll gradually get to. So thanks all, and have a good afternoon.